The delegation would fail. Kale Dorineth knew this the way she knew the color of her own blood, not because anyone had told her, but because she had watched enough of her father's work to understand that failure was the only dialect the Ascendancy truly spoke. She stood at the observation rail of the Vethani flagship solemn decree, her four-fingered hands wrapped around the cold rail, and stared at the place in space where the human ship was supposed to be. The sensors said it was there. The navigational overlay painted a crisp green outline against the dark, tagging it with a designation her people's database could not translate, but the viewport showed nothing. Just the black and the distant red smear of a binary star, and the faintest shiver of something that might have been heat distortion, if heat distortion were possible in a vacuum. Her father, High Consul Dorineth Sar, stood 3 tiers above her on the command gallery, speaking in the formal cadence that meant he was performing for the ship's recorders. His voice carried the practiced gravity of a man who had spent 40 cycles negotiating the internal hierarchies of the Ascendancy's 7-caste system, and believed sincerely that the same tools would work on whatever waited in the dark. Kale did not believe this. She was 11 cycles old, which by Vethani reckoning placed her in the preparatory phase of the scholar caste, old enough to observe, not old enough to speak. Old enough to see the readings on the lateral sensor array, and understand that something about those readings was deeply, fundamentally wrong. "The human vessel remains at station keeping," announced Taven Osh, the ship's primary sensor officer. "No change in aspect, no active emissions detected." "Which is precisely the problem," murmured Kale's tutor, Prelate Osserin, who stood behind her with his hands clasped in the formal posture of the instructor caste. "A ship that size should radiate. Everything radiates." Kale looked at the sensor feed on the nearest display. The outline was there, a hull roughly 400 meters along its longest axis, compact by Vethani standards. The solemn decree was nearly 2 kilometers bow to stern, a vessel built to project the Ascendancy's scale across any negotiating table. 400 meters was small, the kind of small that got dismissed. But the readings inside that outline were the problem. Where there should have been thermal output, there was a temperature that matched the cosmic background to within 1/10 of a degree. Where there should have been drive emissions, there was silence. Where there should have been the electromagnetic noise of an active warship crew moving through corridors, power conduits cycling, communication systems pulsing, there was nothing. It was as if someone had carved a ship-shaped hole in the universe and left only the shape behind. "Father," Kale said, breaking protocol. "The thermal signature is wrong." High Consul Dorineth did not look down. He rarely did when she spoke during official proceedings. Instead, one of his aides, a young woman from the administrative caste named Vaisha, leaned over the gallery rail and made a small gesture that meant "Be silent, child." Kale did not repeat herself. She had learned that lesson. Instead, she opened her personal datapad. Scholar caste trainees were permitted recording devices, one of the few privileges of her station, and began logging her observations. She wrote in the shorthand her mother had taught her before the fever took her, a personal cipher that no one on the ship could read. First entry: the human ship is not hiding, it is choosing what to show us. There is a difference. The delegation had been in transit for 9 days, crossing the buffer zone that separated Ascendancy-controlled space from the region the galactic surveys labeled as unclaimed. Unclaimed was a diplomatic fiction. Everyone knew that the species the surveys called Terrans, or humans, occupied this stretch of the outer arm. Everyone also knew that no species had successfully mapped what the humans actually held, because the humans did not broadcast territorial claims the way the Ascendancy did. They did not erect beacon chains or register sovereignty notices with the Galactic Cartographic Bureau. They simply existed in a region of space, and the ships that entered that region either came back with incomplete data or did not come back at all. The Ascendancy had decided to make formal contact. The decision had been debated across 4 of the 7 castes for the better part of a cycle, which was fast by ascendancy standards. The warrior caste had argued for a full fleet. The diplomatic caste had argued for a single envoy ship. The compromise, as always, was designed to satisfy no one. A single flagship, escorted by 12 patrol corvettes, carrying a delegation led by a high consul of the diplomatic caste, which happened to be Kale's father. He had not wanted to bring her. The Ascendancy's caste protocols did not technically permit a scholar phase child aboard a diplomatic vessel during a first contact operation. But Prelate Ossarin had invoked the observation clause, which allowed trainees to witness historical proceedings for educational purposes, and Kale's father had relented because he understood, though he would never say so publicly, that his daughter saw things that trained diplomats missed. She was seeing one of those things now. "Prelate," Kale said quietly, "may I access the secondary sensor archive?" Ossarin glanced down at her with his pale, vertically slit eyes. "For what purpose?" "I want to compare the hull outline against the database." "The database contains no Terran ship profiles. You know this." "I know. I want to see what it doesn't match." A pause. Ossarin's crest, the ridge of cartilage that ran from his brow to the base of his skull, the Vethani equivalent of a raised eyebrow, shifted slightly. He keyed his authorization into her datapad without another word. Kale worked quickly. The secondary sensor archive contained profiles of every known vessel class from every species the Ascendancy had formally contacted, 312 species, 17,000 vessel classes, ranging from single-occupant shuttles to the continent-sized generation ships of the hollow drift nomads. She ran the human hull outline against the entire database. 0 matches. Not unusual in itself, new species meant new designs. But then she ran a different query. Instead of matching the hull shape, she matched the sensor shadow. Not what the ship looked like, but what the ship's absence of signal looked like. The negative space it created in the sensor field. The results came back in under a second, and they made her breath catch. The shadow matched nothing in the active database, but it matched 3 entries in the historical archive, the archive that logged anomalous sensor contacts from the last 200 cycles. 3 contacts. 3 times a Vethani patrol had detected something that created a ship-shaped void in their sensor field, a zone of perfect silence that moved with purpose and then vanished. 3 times the Ascendancy's warrior caste had investigated afterward and found nothing. No debris, no trail, no evidence that anything had been there at all. The humans had been watching the Ascendancy for 200 cycles, watching and never being seen. Kale wrote in her cipher, second entry, "They have been in our space. Not once, not as an accident. They have been studying us the way we study new species in the taxonomic preserves from the other side of the glass." Above her, her father was speaking again. "Open the formal channel. Transmit the first contact preamble in standard galactic, Vethani formal, and the 3 Terran language variants our linguists have identified." "Transmitting," Taven Osh confirmed. Silence. The kind of silence that pressed against the hull and made the recirculated air taste metallic. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. Kale watched her father's hands. They were clasped behind his back in the posture of patience, but his thumbs were pressing against each other hard enough to blanch the skin. She had seen him do this once before, during the Sethrine arbitration, when the opposing delegation had refused to acknowledge the Ascendancy's caste hierarchy, and he had been forced to negotiate as an equal for the first time in his career. He had come back to their quarters that evening and sat in silence for an hour. "No response," Taven Osh said. "The transmission was received. I can confirm signal absorption at the target coordinates. They heard us. They are choosing not to respond." "Then we wait," High Consul Dorineth said. "Protocol dictates patience. We are guests in their space." This was, Kale noted, the first honest thing her father had said since boarding the ship. The Ascendancy was not accustomed to being a guest in anyone's space. The Vethani had been the regional power in this sector for over 800 cycles. Their caste system was the model, willingly or not, for a dozen subordinate species social structures. Their fleet was the largest within 300 light years. Their diplomatic corps had never failed to achieve at least a partial framework agreement with any species they had contacted. But they had also never contacted a species they could not see. The hours crept past. Kale ate a ration bar in the observation alcove and continued her research. She cross-referenced the 3 historical shadow contacts with the Ascendancy's expansion timeline, and found something that made the ration bar sit heavy in her stomach. Each of the 3 contacts had occurred within one cycle of the Ascendancy absorbing a new client species. The first, 200 cycles ago, when the Ascendancy had formalized its protectorate over the Ossarin Shoals. The second, 140 cycles ago, when the Dreth Compact had been incorporated. The third, 62 cycles ago, when the Mavani had accepted caste integration. Each time the Ascendancy had grown, someone had come to look. Third entry, they were not studying us the way we study specimens. They were studying us the way a physician studies a disease, checking to see if we were still spreading. Kale pulled up the navigational charts for the buffer zone and ran a density analysis on the space between the Ascendancy's outermost beacon chain and the region marked unclaimed. The analysis took longer than she expected. When the results came back, she sat very still for several minutes. The buffer zone was not empty. It was seeded with micro-scale sensor platforms, objects so small that the solemn decree's survey sweeps had classified them as natural debris. Metallic particulates, sub-centimeter fragments tumbling in orbits that looked random, except they were not random. Kale ran the orbital trajectories backward, and discovered that each fragment maintained a fixed line of sight to at least one other fragment, forming a distributed sensor mesh that covered the entire buffer zone like a net made of dust. The humans had turned the empty space between their territory and the Ascendancy's into a listening device. Every ship that had crossed this zone in the last Kale checked the orbital decay rates and felt her stomach drop. The last 80 cycles had been tracked, catalogued, and almost certainly recorded. The solemn decree had been watched from the moment it crossed the first beacon. She showed the data to Ossarin. His crest went rigid and stayed that way. "Do not share this yet," he said quietly. "Let your father have his negotiation. There will be time for the truth afterward." Kale disagreed but obeyed. She was scholar caste. Obedience was in the classification. The response came 18 hours after the initial transmission. Kale was dozing in her alcove when the ship's alert tone brought her upright. The observation deck was half empty. Most of the delegation had retired, leaving only a skeleton diplomatic watch. Her father, she noted, had not left. He stood at the gallery rail with a cup of cold stimulant in his hand, and the expression of a man who had been waiting his entire career for a door to open. "Contact," Taven Osh said, and his voice was different now. The professional comm had a crack in it. "Multiple contacts. The hull outline at the primary coordinates is it's changing." Kale scrambled to the nearest sensor display and nearly knocked Prelate Ossarin sideways. The old instructor caught her by the shoulder but did not reprimand her. He was staring at the display with the same expression. The ship-shaped void at the center of the sensor field was still there, but it was no longer alone. Around it, like petals opening from a stem, new voids were appearing. 1, 3, 7, 12. Each one a hull outline that the sensors could see but that the viewport showed as empty space. Each one broadcasting the same perfect silence, the same cosmic background temperature skin, the same absence of everything a ship should emit. 13 vessels, Taven Osh said. "No, 14, 15. They are still appearing. Some of them are behind us." A murmur through the command gallery. Kale's father raised one hand and the murmur died. Behind us, he repeated, specify. 4 vessels have appeared between our position and the transit corridor we used to enter this region. They are positioned along our return route at intervals that correspond exactly to our navigation waypoints. A pause. High Consul, they know the route we took, every waypoint. They were tracking us from the moment we crossed the buffer zone. Kale noted that Taven Osh had just arrived at the conclusion. She had reached 6 hours ago. She felt the silence change. It was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence of comprehension, the moment when the delegation understood, collectively, that they had not come to meet the humans. The humans had allowed them to arrive. Escort corvette commanders are requesting orders, the communications officer reported. Commander Prathais of the Blade Ascendant is recommending defensive formation. Denied, her father said immediately. All escorts hold position. No weapons activation, no shield deployment. We came to talk. We will talk. Kale watched the sensor display as the 12 Vethani corvettes held their formation around the solemn decree, surrounded on all sides by ships they could not see. The corvettes were each 300 meters long, armed with plasma batteries and kinetic projectors that could crack the crust of a small moon. They were the Ascendancy's teeth, deployed whenever diplomacy needed emphasis. Against ships they could detect and track and target, the corvettes were formidable. Against ships that existed as negative space on their sensor displays, weapons they could not lock onto, hulls they could not resolve into targeting solutions against those, the corvettes were ornamental. Then the viewport shifted. Not suddenly, there was no flash, no dramatic reveal. The ship simply stopped being invisible. One moment there was empty space. The next, the light that had been bending around the hull ceased to bend, and the ship was there. Kale pressed her face to the viewport and forgot to breathe. It was not 400 meters long. The sensor outline had been 400 meters because the ship had been showing them 400 meters. What hung in the void now was easily twice that, a lean, angular hull that tapered to a knife-edge prow, its surface a matte charcoal that seemed to drink the starlight rather than reflect it. The hull was scarred. Not the fresh scarring of recent combat, but the deep, weathered scarring of a vessel that had been in service for a very long time. Panel lines ran in precise geometric patterns across the surface, interrupted by weld seams and repair patches that told a story of maintenance and use. Gun ports, dozens of them, arrayed in staggered rows along the flanks, were sealed but visible, each one a dark circle that promised nothing and implied everything. And along the dorsal spine, in raised characters that caught the light of the binary star, a designation that Kale's datapad struggled to translate before settling on a phonetic approximation. TCS Stillwater. "It's beautiful," Kale whispered, and was immediately embarrassed because that was not a scholar-cast observation. Scholars did not assess beauty. They assessed function, taxonomy, capability. But it was beautiful. The way a blade is beautiful when you understand the purpose behind every curve. The other ships appeared in the same gradual way, not decloaking in a burst of energy, but simply allowing themselves to be seen. As if visibility were a courtesy they extended rather than a state they normally occupied. Some were smaller, sleeker, clearly built for speed hulls like polished stone with intake vents along their flanks that glowed a faint, contained blue. Others were broader, heavier, their flanks thick with armor plating and weapon arrays that the solemn decree's targeting computer could not identify. The computer kept trying, cycling through its threat assessment database, matching profiles, finding nothing, cycling again. Kale watched it loop 3 times before she muted the alert. None of them matched the sensor outlines the solemn decree's instruments had been painting for the past 18 hours. They had been showing the Vethani exactly what they wanted the Vethani to see, and now they were showing something else. Kavith Rull, the warrior caste advisor, had moved to the tactical station without anyone noticing. His face was the color of old bone. "The 4 ships on our return route are the largest in the formation," he said, his voice stripped of everything except the data. "Each one is approximately 1,200 meters, comparable to the decree. Their weapons signatures are unclear. I cannot get a reliable read." "Because they are still controlling what you see," Cale said, loudly enough to carry. Every head on the command gallery turned to look at her. Kavith Rull stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "The child is correct. These readings are not incomplete data. They are curated data. They are showing us their hulls but not their capabilities." "High Consul," Taven Osh said, and his voice had gone very quiet. "I am receiving a transmission from the lead vessel. Audio only. It is in Vethani formal." Cale's father straightened. "Put it through." The voice that filled the observation deck was female, and it spoke Cale's language with an accent that was precise, without being perfect, the accent of someone who had learned the language from recordings rather than from speakers. Every consonant was correct. Every tonal shift was accurate. But there was something underneath the precision that was not Vethani at all, a cadence that carried the weight of a species that had been watching and listening for a very long time. "High Consul Dorineth Sar, I am Commander Odessa Voss of the Terran Confederacy ship Stillwater. Your preamble has been received and is acknowledged. We have been aware of the Ascendancy's intention to make formal contact for approximately one of your cycles. We chose to allow this delegation to proceed because we believe it is time for a direct conversation." A pause that lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. "We have questions about the Dreth Compact. We will meet in person." The transmission ended. No offer of protocol exchange. No request for a schedule. No diplomatic niceties. Just a statement of fact and a condition. Cale watched her father's face. The consul's expression did not change, but his thumbs pressed together until the joints cracked audibly. The Dreth Compact had been incorporated into the Ascendancy 140 cycles ago. It had not been a voluntary incorporation. The official record described it as a caste integration by mutual agreement, but Cale had read the primary sources in the Scholar Archive, and she knew that mutual agreement meant the Dreth had been given a choice between accepting the Ascendancy's caste system or having their trade routes blockaded until their economy collapsed. They had chosen integration. Within 2 generations, their language had been reclassified as a dialect, their governing council had been dissolved, and their population had been sorted into castes that the Dreth themselves had no voice in selecting. The humans wanted to talk about that. 4th entry, they did not come to be contacted, they came to take a deposition. The meeting was arranged for the following day cycle. Commander Voss proposed a neutral location, a cargo module detached from the Stillwater and positioned in the space between the 2 flagships. Cale's father agreed because there was no tactical advantage in refusing. Cale was not supposed to attend. The observation clause permitted her to witness proceedings aboard the solemn decree, not to leave the ship. But Prelate Ossarin, in what Cale later understood was either a profound act of educational commitment or a calculated act of political sabotage, argued that the educational value of witnessing an in-person first contact outweighed the protocol restriction. Her father overruled Ossarin. Ossarin invoked the prelate's discretion. Her father threatened to have Ossarin confined to quarters. Ossarin quoted the 4th Accord of the Scholar Caste, which stated that no prelate acting in educational capacity could be confined without the approval of the Scholar Convocation, which was 11 light-years away. Cale stood in the shuttle bay, listening to 2 adult males argue about her presence in increasingly technical legal language, and reflected that the caste system was very good at producing rules and very bad at producing outcomes. In the end, she went. Her father did not speak to her during the shuttle crossing. The cargo module was Spartan. Metal walls, recycled air with a faint mineral taste that Cale did not recognize, a single table bolted to the deck with chairs on either side. The lighting was neutral, not tuned to Vethani visual preferences, not tuned to anything, just light. Two small viewports flanked the entrance, and through them Cale could see the hull of the Stillwater hanging in the dark, close enough that its panel lines were visible to the naked eye, the repair patches catching the starlight in slightly different textures where the alloy composition had changed between one maintenance cycle and the next. Commander Voss was already seated when they arrived. She was smaller than Cale had expected. The Vethani averaged 2.5 meters in height. Commander Voss was perhaps 1 3/4, with close-cropped hair the color of iron filings and hands that rested on the table with a stillness that Cale recognized. It was the stillness of someone who did not need to move to communicate threat. Her uniform was dark, unadorned except for a small insignia on the collar that Cale's datapad identified as a rank marker, and a thin band of color on the left cuff that might have been a unit identifier or a service record. Cale could not tell. Beside her sat a younger human male, dark-skinned, with the same quiet hands and an expression that suggested he had been in rooms like this before and found them neither interesting nor threatening. He carried a flat device that Cale assumed was a recording instrument, though it displayed nothing visible. And beside him, in a chair that had been adjusted to accommodate shorter legs, sat a child. Cale stared. The child stared back. She was perhaps 7 or 8 cycles old by Vethani reckoning, though Cale had no framework for estimating human age. She had her mother's jaw and her father's coloring, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap in a posture that was so precisely composed that Cale understood immediately. This child had been trained to sit in rooms like this. She was not a curiosity or an accident. She was here on purpose. "My daughter," Commander Voss said, as if this required no further explanation. "Ren." Cale's father opened his mouth, closed it, and then said the most diplomatically neutral thing possible. "We are honored by your family's presence." Commander Voss inclined her head. "High Consul." "Shall we begin?" The negotiation, though Cale came to understand that negotiation was not the right word, lasted 4 hours. Commander Voss did not raise her voice. She did not make threats. She did not reference the 15 ships outside the viewport or the fact that 4 of them were positioned along the Ascendancy's escape route. She simply asked questions. She asked about the Dreth Compact. Specifically, she asked about the caste assignment methodology, how individuals were sorted, what criteria were used, what happened to those who resisted classification. She asked these questions in the tone of someone who already knew the answers but wanted them on the record. She asked about the Asuran Shoals, about the Mavani integration, about the 11 other client species, whose sovereignty had been absorbed into the Ascendancy over the past 3 centuries. Cale's father answered each question in the formal, layered language of the diplomatic caste. He spoke about historical context and cultural integration frameworks, and the mutual benefits of the Ascendancy's social structure. He cited participation rates and economic indicators and satisfaction surveys conducted by the administrative caste. Each answer was technically accurate. Each answer was carefully designed to present the truth from an angle that made it look like something other than what it was. Cale watched Commander Voss's face during these answers. The human woman's expression did not change. She listened with the same measured attention to each response, occasionally glancing at the flat device carried by the man beside her. Once, Cale saw the device's surface shimmer briefly, data being received or verified, and Commander Voss's eyes narrowed by a fraction before returning to neutral. "She knows," Cale thought. "She already has the data. She is comparing his answers to the data, and every time he reshapes the truth, she is logging the gap." Then Commander Voss asked about the children. That was where Cale's attention sharpened to a point. Commander Voss asked, in the same measured tone, what happened to children of absorbed species who showed aptitude for a caste higher than the one their parents had been assigned to. She asked whether caste mobility was possible for non-Vethani citizens. She asked whether the scholar archive contained any record of a non-Vethani individual holding a position in the upper three castes in the entire 800-cycle history of the ascendancy. Kale knew the answer. The answer was no. Her father gave a longer answer. He spoke about merit-based review processes and intergenerational mobility pathways, and the theoretical framework for cross-caste advancement that the diplomatic caste had proposed at the last convocation. He spoke well. He spoke at length. He spoke the way he always spoke when the truth was simple and uncomfortable, and he needed to bury it under procedure. Commander Voss listened to all of it. Then she turned to her daughter and said in Vethani, "Ren, what did you hear?" The girl Ren looked at Kale's father with an expression that was not hostile or dismissive but simply clear, the way glass is clear, and said, "He said no, but he used more words." Silence. Kale felt something shift in the room, not the political balance that had been tilted from the moment the ships appeared. Something smaller and more important. She looked at Ren, and Ren looked back at her, and for a moment they were just two children sitting in a metal box between stars, watching their parents do what parents did: construct elaborate architectures of language to avoid saying the thing that was true. Kale opened her datapad under the table and wrote, "Fifth entry. The human child sees the same things I see. She just does not have to be silent about them." The meeting continued. Commander Voss presented, not demanded, not threatened, but presented what she called a framework for observation. The Terran Confederacy had been monitoring the Ascendancy's expansion for what Kale now understood was the entirety of her people's interstellar history. 200 cycles of watching, 200 cycles of cataloging how the Vethani treated the species they absorbed. The framework was simple. The Ascendancy would not be required to dismantle its caste system. It would not be required to release its client species. It would be required to allow independent observation of its caste assignment processes, its education systems, and its treatment of non-Vethani populations. The observations would be conducted by Terran personnel embedded within Ascendancy institutions. The results would be compiled and shared with both governments and with any client species that requested them. "And if we refuse?" High Consul Dorinath asked. "Then this conversation becomes our only formal interaction," Commander Voss said. "And the Ascendancy continues without knowing what we have already shared with your client populations." Another silence, longer this time. Kale understood the implication before her father did. She could see it in the way his crest flattened, the involuntary Vethani response to a threat that the conscious mind had not yet processed. The humans had not just been watching the Ascendancy. They had been talking to the species the Ascendancy had absorbed. They had been sharing information. They had been doing this for long enough that it mattered. The Dreth, the Asurin, the Mivani, all the quiet, compliant, caste-sorted populations that the Ascendancy treated as settled matters. The humans had been showing them the glass from the other side. Kale looked at Ren. Ren was watching Kale's father with an expression that Kale needed a moment to identify, because it was not an expression she had ever seen on a child's face in the Ascendancy. It was patience, not the enforced patience of a child trained to be silent, not the resigned patience of a child waiting for adults to finish. It was the patient, measured patience of someone who understood what was happening and was content to wait for the other person to catch up. Ren caught Kale looking. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that Kale's datapad flagged as a common human expression of curiosity. Kale tilted her own head in response. It was not a Vethani gesture. She did not know why she did it. The meeting ended with her father requesting a recess. Commander Voss agreed. The two delegations returned to their respective ships. On the shuttle back, Kale's father sat with his hands folded and said nothing. Prelate Asurin sat beside Kale and said nothing. The shuttle pilot said nothing. The diplomatic aides said nothing. The silence was not empty. It was full, crammed with the things no one was saying, the realizations no one was yet willing to voice. Kale wrote in her datapad, "Sixth entry. My father's silence is not the silence of thought. It is the silence of a man discovering that the house he has lived in his entire life has walls made of glass, and someone has been standing outside watching for longer than he knew the house existed." The recess lasted 3 days. During those 3 days, Kale did what scholars did. She investigated. She accessed every archive available to her security clearance and several that were not, using Ossarin's credentials when her own proved insufficient. She mapped the Ascendancy's expansion history against the shadow contacts in the sensor logs. She cross-referenced the micro-sensor mesh in the buffer zone with the patrol schedules the warrior caste had maintained for the past century. She built a timeline of every anomalous report from the border regions, every unexplained sensor ghost, every patrol that returned with corrupted data logs, every deep space relay that had malfunctioned and been replaced without investigation. The pattern was overwhelming. The humans had not merely been watching from the border, they had been inside Ascendancy space, repeatedly, consistently, for longer than anyone had suspected. Their stealth technology was not merely good, it was a philosophy. They did not simply avoid detection, they controlled what was detected. Every sensor reading the Ascendancy had ever taken of the border region had been, in effect, a curated exhibition. The humans had shown the Vethani exactly what the Vethani expected to see: empty space, unclaimed territory, a region not worth the effort of serious exploration. And behind that curtain, they had been building something. Kale could not determine what exactly because the data was not there, but the absence of data was itself data. The perfect, consistent 200-cycle absence of any information about what lay beyond the buffer zone was not the result of emptiness. It was the result of someone actively ensuring that no information escaped. On the second day, she found something else. Buried in the communications archive was a file flagged as a routine equipment test, a burst of modulated subspace static that had been recorded by the Solemn Decree's long-range array during the transit. The file had been auto-classified as interference and archived without review. Kale opened it and ran a pattern analysis. It was not static. It was a compressed data transmission, sent on a frequency the Ascendancy did not monitor, using an encryption scheme the Ascendancy systems had not recognized as encryption. The transmission had originated from within the Ascendancy's own beacon network, from one of the sovereignty markers that the administrative caste maintained along the border. The humans had placed a transmitter inside an Ascendancy beacon. The beacon had been sending data for Kale checked the maintenance logs at least 37 cycles. Every ship that passed within range, every communication that bounced off the beacon's relay node, every navigational update that the beacon exchanged with its neighbors, all of it, forwarded to someone who was listening. She showed this to Ossarin on the second evening, along with her full timeline and the buffer zone sensor mesh data. He read her notes in silence, his crest rigid. "You understand," he said finally, "that if you present this to your father's delegation, it will change the nature of the negotiation fundamentally." "It is already changed," Kale said. "They changed it by showing themselves." Everything before this was them deciding whether to show themselves. Ossarin regarded her for a long moment. "You are too young for the conclusions you are drawing." "Is that a caste objection or a factual one?" He almost smiled. "Bring it to the morning briefing, all of it." Kale brought her timeline, her sensor analysis, and the intercepted transmission to the briefing. She presented it in the formal style of the scholar caste, with citations and confidence intervals, and the careful hedging language that scholars use to distance themselves from their own findings. But the findings spoke clearly enough. The room listened, her father listened. When she finished, The senior warrior caste advisor, a broad-shouldered man named Kavith Rull, whose presence on the ship had been a concession to the warrior caste's insistence on security assessment capability, spoke first. The child is right. We have been penetrated for 2 centuries. Our territorial integrity is a polite fiction that these humans have been maintaining because it served their purposes. He turned to the High Consul. The question is not whether we accept their observation framework. The question is what they will do if we give them a reason to stop observing and start acting. And what would that look like? Asked Vaishya, the administrative aide, her voice careful. We do not know, Kavith Rull said. That is the point. We do not know what they have, we do not know where they have it, and we do not know what they are willing to do with it. The only thing we know is that they have been inside our space for 200 cycles, and we never detected them once until they chose to be detected. He looked at the viewport, where the still water hung in the dark like a promise. They are not showing us their military capability. They are showing us that they have been polite. Kale's father looked at her. For the first time in the journey, he looked directly at her, not as a protocol problem or a caste complication, but as a person who had told him something he needed to hear. How certain are you? He asked. The sensor correlations are above 90% confidence, Kale said. The beacon transmitter is physical evidence. The historical pattern is consistent across 200 cycles. The probability that this is coincidental is less than 1 in 10,000. Her father nodded slowly. Then we accept the framework. Consul, one of the diplomatic aides, began. We accept, her father repeated, because my daughter has just demonstrated that refusing would mean pretending we have a choice in a situation where the choice was made 200 cycles ago by people who were already in the room. The chamber went quiet, not the suppressed quiet of dissent swallowed, but the deeper quiet of people arriving at the same conclusion through different paths and finding, for once, that they agreed. The second meeting took place the following day. It lasted 40 minutes. High Consul Dorineth accepted the observation framework with 2 modifications, a notification protocol for observer arrivals, and a quarterly review mechanism that gave the scholar caste formal jurisdiction over the observation reports. Commander Voss agreed to both without hesitation, which told Kale that the modifications had been anticipated, perhaps even desired. Documents were exchanged. Hands Vethani 4-fingered, human 5-fingered were clasped in the gesture that both species, by coincidence or convergence, used to seal an agreement. Kale watched from her position at the back of the Vethani delegation. She was supposed to be recording the proceedings for the Scholar Archive. She was doing so, but she was also watching Ren. The human girl had sat through the entire meeting without speaking. She had watched her mother negotiate with the same quiet attention that Kale recognized from her own experience of watching her father work. But where Kale watched with the analytical distance of a scholar cataloging, assessing, filing, Ren watched with something else. Something that Kale's vocabulary did not have a word for, but that she understood instinctively. Ren watched the way someone watches when they know that what is happening matters and they want to remember it correctly. Not for a report, not for an archive, for themselves. After the documents were sealed, Commander Voss rose and spoke briefly to Kale's father about the timeline for the first observer's 6 personnel, arriving within 2 cycles, embedded in the Dreth educational system as a starting point. Then she turned to her daughter and said something in a language Kale's datapad could not translate, not one of the 3 Terran language variants the Ascendancy's linguists had identified, but something older, more personal, possibly a family tongue or a regional dialect that the Ascendancy's intercept archives had never captured. Ren nodded. She stood, crossed the space between the 2 delegations with the unself-conscious directness that Kale had come to associate with human movement, and stopped in front of Kale. She was shorter than Kale by half a meter. Her eyes were dark and steady and held no trace of the careful performance that Vethani children were taught from birth, the downcast gaze of the lower castes, the level stare of the warrior caste, the measured neutrality of the diplomatic caste. Ren's eyes were simply open, looking, seeing. "I read about your species," Ren said, in careful Vethani. Her accent was different from her mother's, less precise, more musical, as if she had learned the language from a different source. A different generation of recordings, perhaps, or from a native speaker rather than a translation matrix. "I read that the scholar caste watches and records. That is what I want to do when I am older." Watch and record. Kale looked at this small human person and felt something rearrange itself in her understanding of the universe. Not the political arrangement that was her father's domain, and it would be argued and refined and reshaped for decades. Something more fundamental. Something about what it meant to be a child in a room full of adults making decisions about the shape of the future, and to understand those decisions more clearly than the adults making them, and to carry that understanding in silence because the system that shaped you did not include a category for children who saw too much. "That is what I do," Kale said, "but in my system I am not permitted to speak about what I see." Ren considered this. Her brow furrowed another human expression, one that Kale's datapad identified as concentration or concern. "In my system," she said, "they taught me to speak. That is why my mother brought me, so that when I saw what was true I could say it." They stood for a moment, two children on either side of a divide that was not political or territorial, but something older and more personal, the divide between a system that sorted its children into silence and a system that taught its children to speak. Around them, the adults were exchanging final courtesies, the ritual phrases that diplomats used to fill the space between agreement and departure. None of them were looking at the two children standing in the center of the room. Kale reached into her satchel and pulled out her datapad. She opened a new entry and wrote, in standard Vethani rather than her private cipher, so that Ren could read it. "You see the same things I see." Ren read it. She looked up at Kale with an expression that was not surprise, because she was not surprised but recognition. The recognition of one watcher finding another. "Yes," Ren said. Kale added a second line. "That is the first real contact." Ren read it. She smiled, a human expression that Kale's datapad translated as indicating warmth, agreement, and the beginning of trust. Then Ren reached into her own pocket and produced a small object, a flat disc of polished metal, no larger than a coin, with a pattern etched into its surface that Kale's datapad could not identify. Ren held it out. "This is from my world," Ren said. "It is called a compass. It shows you which way you are facing. I want you to have it." Kale took the disc. It was warm from Ren's hand. She turned it over and watched a tiny needle inside swing and settle, pointing at something, a magnetic pole, perhaps, or a calibrated reference point that existed somewhere far away, on a world Kale had never seen. She reached into her own satchel and found the only personal item she had brought, a smooth river stone from the banks of the Vethani capital's ceremonial canal, dark blue with a vein of silver mineral running through it. Her mother had given it to her, years ago, and told her that the best scholars carried a piece of the world they came from, so they would always remember what they were observing for. She held it out. "This is from my world. It is supposed to remind me where I come from." Ren took the stone and held it carefully, as if she understood its weight. On the shuttle back to the solemn decree, Kale sat beside her father. He was quiet, but it was a different quiet than before. Not the silence of defeat or comprehension, but the silence of a man recalculating, reassessing, beginning the long, difficult process of understanding that the world he had built his career in was not the world he had believed it to be. "Your analysis was correct," he said without looking at her. "Yes." "The scholar convocation will want to review it." "Yes." "They will not be pleased." "No." "The warrior caste will demand a full security audit of every beacon in the network." The administrative caste will resist because of the cost. The diplomatic caste will try to use the audit as leverage in the next convocation. And the three lower castes will not be told at all, because that is how we handle information that challenges the structure. Kale said nothing. It was the most honest assessment of the ascendancy's internal dynamics that her father had ever spoken aloud. He was quiet for another moment. Then, "You spoke with the human child." "Yes." "What did she say?" Kale thought about this. She thought about the observation framework and the 200 cycles of invisible watching and the 15 ships that were already disappearing back into the void, one by one, returning to the invisibility that was not hiding but choosing. She thought about the caste system and the Dreth and the Mavani, and all the quiet, sorted populations who were about to discover that someone had been watching their sorting with careful, patient, unblinking attention. She thought about the compass in her satchel, its needle pointing toward a world she had never seen, and the river stone that was now traveling in the opposite direction, carried by a girl who would remember its weight. She thought about Ren's smile. She said yes, Kale said. Her father waited for more. When none came, he nodded and turned to look out the viewport at the space where the human ships had been. There was nothing there now. Just the dark and the binary star, and the silence of a species that had spent 200 years learning everything it needed to know before saying a single word. Kale opened her datapad and wrote her final entry. 7th entry. First contact is not the moment when two species see each other. First contact is the moment when two species understand that they have always been seen. The humans understood this before we arrived. We are only now beginning to learn it. And somewhere in the space between our understanding and theirs, two children exchanged objects from their home worlds, and that small act carried more weight than every document the diplomats signed. Because the documents will be debated and revised and argued over for cycles to come, but the compass still points, and the stone still remembers. The solemn decree turned for home. Behind it, in the perfect silence of the void, something that was not empty space watched it go. And somewhere on a ship that was already invisible, a girl named Ren was turning a dark blue stone over in her hands, tracing the vein of silver with her thumb, writing in her own journal, in her own language, about a Vethani girl who saw the same things she did and carried the same weight of seeing. Neither of them knew it yet, but that was the beginning. Not of a treaty, not of an alliance, not of the slow political machinery that would grind through both civilizations for decades to come. Not of the observer program that would eventually catalog every caste assignment in the Ascendancy's history and present the findings to populations who had never been asked whether they consented to be sorted. Not of the quiet revolution that would begin in the Dreth schools when the first human observer sat in the back of a classroom and watched a Dreth child be told, for the first time, which caste she belonged to. The beginning of something smaller and more important than any of that. The beginning of being understood.